Okay, in this video, I'm going to discuss how we can break up a non-trivial refactoring into a series of small, safe steps. And I'm going to use as my focus here this schema method. It takes an optional argument called ashash, which defaults to true. And what I want to do in this refactoring is just eliminate this optional argument. And the reason I want to do that is optional arguments effectively act as a hidden conditional, and especially in the case where they are Boolean optional arguments, and even more so in the case where they are hard-coded values. They're not coming from user input. They're not coming from like the database. All the calling locations have either defaulting to true or they hard code and pass the value false to override that. And so rather than having these calling locations converge upon one method and then having that conditionally fork back out into one of two behaviors, I'd rather just have the calling location invoke the behavior at once by calling the appropriate method, because that's simpler, and then you don't have a conditional at all. This will become clear, I think, as I go through the refactoring steps. So what I'm going to start with here is what I think is the most obviously safe step that you can take, which is to just duplicate this method. So once I've done this, we have two copies, and the first one just gets overridden by the second one, so my editor just highlights it, basically showing me that this definition just isn't being used. It's not doing anything. Okay, now I happen to know that in two places in the code I've looked through ahead of time where we're passing false to override the value of ashash so that it's false instead of true. And they are here in this test schema, or helper.schema false, and then here in database.rb in the schema as JSON method, we're saying helper.schema false. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this second definition and just say schema no hash. It's going to be a new method. It is exactly the same in terms of behavior as schema. It just has a new name. Nothing's calling it at this point. It has no syntax errors. So at this point right now, I could run all my tests. Everything would just still pass, right? We're totally safe. Now what I'm going to do is go to this place where we're calling schema, we're passing false. I'm going to call this schema no hash, and I'm going to do the same thing over here. So schema no hash, and you'll see that would be totally safe here. And now what I'm going to do is default the definition of as hash here to false, which means that when we pass false explicitly here, that's no longer necessary because it's already going to be false. So now I can just delete both of these false values, and things are still totally good, and that was totally safe. Now what I'm going to do is I want to take this content in the middle because it's completely the same, right? It's duplicated in both methods. The value of ashash is the only thing that changes, but everything inside them is totally the same. So I have an automatic refactoring I can use here, and so I'm going to call this schema default, let's just say, for lack of a better word. And when I do this, my editor is going to do something really convenient here. It's going to notice that I had that exact same content that I'm turning into its own method right here, and it's going to ask me, would you like to also include that in the refactoring? So I'll say yes. I'm just going to say all occurrences. So now both of these cases, schema and schema no hash, just call schema default, and they pass an as hash argument. But notice that it is no longer an optional argument. So it's a Boolean argument, but it's not optional. It's a required argument. Now, in both of these cases here, we're no longer passing a value for as hash. We were never passing true. We would only pass false to override true. And our new method, we're always using the false case. So we don't need to do this. So if I just pass true here in the value of as hash, you'll see instantly here that as hash, the argument just becomes gray, right? It's not being used, which means it's safe to remove because I know it's also not being passed anywhere. So my arity is not going to be a problem, the number of arguments I'm passing. And I'll do the same thing here. I'm going to pass false, which means that this will turn gray as well. My editor's saying, you're not using that. I happen to know in those two locations we were passing false. We were no longer doing that. We're relying on the method just defining it to be false. But now we're doing that here, so I can just remove this as well. Cool, so things are getting, I think, gradually simpler and simpler. Now what I want to do is make this observation here with this if as hash at the end here. I can turn this into an if else, and it will sort of reveal something here. So if I say if as hash, return this else, let's move my blob.content up. Just do an automatic sort of reindentation here. There we go. So this return is redundant now. I don't need it. So now these two return values in the two cases, true or false, are basically the same. The only difference here, we start with blob.content, is that, oh, also I can get rid of this if as hash. The only difference here is that I tack on, in the true case, this with indifferent access, right? That's the only thing that's changing here. So I'm going to go up here to this previous line where we're saying return nil if blob.nil or blob.content.nil. The point of this return is that if there's a nil value here, we don't want to get a no method error for nil. So for instance, right now, if you didn't do this blob.content.nil case, it's possible you could say blob.content.within different access, and you get undefined method with indifferent access for nil, and we don't want that. But there's a better way we can do this, or an alternative way, which is we can use the safe navigation operator, which just says if this is nil, then just don't call this method, just return the nil immediately, which means that it just obviates the need for that. So we don't need that anymore. Once we've done that, I can actually move this because there's only one case where we're calling with the value of true for as hash, and that's right up here. By the way, I just forgot to take away these sort of superfluous return values there, so I don't need those. But given that we're only passing true here, so this will only be used in that one case, I can just move this up here. And that's really handy because what that reveals is that in either the true or the false case, we're just doing blob.content. It doesn't make any difference, so I'm just going to move that here, and then I can just delete this code right here completely. Okay, so now we're saying return nil if blob.nil. The only reason we're doing that is because if blob is nil, we don't want to say nil.content. That would be a no method error, undefined method content for nil. So I'll just do the safe navigation operator, and this entire line just goes away. So now we are just saying blob equals schema.json blob. Oh, by the way, when I got rid of that conditional that it was using as hash, this no longer is used at all. However, it is being passed. So if I want to safely get rid of this, I can just make it an optional argument. I can even just take that name away altogether. Then I can take away the false case. I can take away the true case. And now we can just get rid of this altogether because it's not being used at all. So now I can, we assign this temp variable blob equals, and then we say blob ampersand dot content. We don't need that temp variable at all. We can just delete this, and it's just not even used. And we can just say schema.json blob ampersand dot content. Great, so this is getting pretty simple. Now we have no conditionals at all. There's no optional arguments. We just call the right method that we want. And we see that in the end, all that as hash true is doing is tacking on with indifferent access to the end of the schema here. So one final observation, however, is that in the case where we say schema no hash, this effectively is an alias for schema default, right? It's just doing the same thing. So it would be totally safe for me to just replace this with this. So in the interim here we have this duplication. However, now that we are moving this definition into schema no hash, then right here we can just change that schema default reference to schema no hash. And that means that schema default is not even being called. So we can just get rid of it. So now we're back to the case where we just have the minimal thing, which is just two methods, and there's no conditionals. And I think things are pretty readable. And you'll see that, again, you can go back and review every step along the way. We found ways to be able to make one small, very safe step at a time. And one of the chief techniques I used there was to use an optional argument in just an interim sense. You can use that optional argument, then you can go change the calling locations, then you can just remove the optional argument, right? And also one other technique I used here was I temporarily had duplication. I made a copy of that original method as a means, sort of an interim method to dry it back up, but using a better abstraction. So sometimes a little duplication can be fine, especially if it's just an interim sense, and eventually it's going to go away again once you're completing the refactoring. So that concludes that, and I hope you found this useful. Thank you.